Night's Watch. Spade crouched in an alley off Carrington Road, his sore muscles aching as he tried to stay still, quiet, and hidden. He'd watched from this observation spot as the lamps were lit just after sundown. He had seen the crowds of journeymen and clerks walk to their homes with their workdays completed, and he'd even caught snatches of the midnight reveries that went on in this part of town. He'd witnessed a bloody brawl that had spilled out of a tavern, seen 3 night wenches bring their clients down the alley for their business, and he was sure he'd seen at least 1 robbery, though he couldn't be sure. All the while he'd stayed where he was, sitting beneath the widespread wings of a crouching gargoyle, waiting until the wolf's bell sounded. It wasn't long after that bell rang out that Spade heard the flapping of wings. A raven with a scar across its beak landed on a refuse barrel and croaked. Spade shifted a little closer, and the bird turned to look at him.
"Gold,"
the bird said. Spade grinned, and Croaker flapped off, making for another alleyway. The familiar was their eyes in the sky, and the bird was the one who would tell them whether the cart full of the town's tax revenue for the quarter was coming this way or not. Spade straightened up, and his knees popped as he made his way toward the mouth of the alley. After tonight, the highwayman was going to retire. No more stagecoach robberies on abandoned roads. No more trying to catch merchant caravans and hoping they had something worth stealing. Even split a dozen ways, the take from this one job would be enough that none of them would ever need to steal again. Most of the gang would, Spade knew that well enough, but it wouldn't be him. Not this time. He put his back to the bricks and listened. He could hear an overloaded wagon trundling down the road. As it grew closer, Spade pulled up his mask and drew his sword. It was almost time. The wagon was a plain thing, built from heavy timbers and pulled by a pair of chestnut workhorses. The driver sat on the bench, bundled against the night's chill, a pair of bullseye lanterns mounted on twin posts pointing forward to light their way. Just as they passed the alley, Spade heard a sound like thick mud being thrown against the bricks. The horses whinnied and the brakes squealed, but there was no sound of a crash. Spade was moving before the sound had stopped. The wagon and its horses were caught in a huge, sticky web that had appeared from nowhere, stretching from one side of the street to the other. The driver had thrown themselves clear of the seat, and they were crumpled on the cobbles, unmoving beneath their black cloak. Spade saw Racker and Clegg emerging from the opposite alley. The former had his meaty hand wrapped around the grip of a bar mace, and the latter cradled his crossbow. Spade gestured Clegg toward the downed driver, and then pointed Racker toward the rear door of the ensnared wagon. "Like clockwork, Vorman said, the conjurer stepping out of the shadows at Spade's right. He'd never gotten used to the wizard's habit of just appearing out of nowhere. "Don't jinx it now," Spade hissed. "Guffin nonsense," Vorman said, clapping Spade on the shoulder. Racker lifted the latch on the rear of the wagon, but before he could do anything else, the rear door flew outward, slamming into the big man hard enough to send him flying a dozen feet. A figure hauled itself out of the rear storage area, and before Spade could get a look at it, Vorman was slinging a spell. The magic flew from the wizard's fingers, but it broke like a wave against a rock as the person-shaped thing stood to its full height and turned toward them. The expression on the golem's face was neutral as it glanced toward the others. "Oh, hell with this," Vorman said. The conjurer raised one hand to weave another spell, but before he could, a blur of red crashed into him. By the time Spade had turned, the wizard had collapsed, and a pseudo-dragon crouched on his chest, preening. Spade saw the badge on the creature's chest, worn like a breastplate. He turned toward Clegg, but just as he did, he saw the supposedly unconscious driver lash out with their foot, kicking Clegg's crossbow out of his hands. He was reaching for his backup weapon when the downed figure drove the heel of their boot up between Clegg's legs, and he folded like a coward's courage. "The hell with this is right," Spade said. He bolted from the wagon, shooting back into the alley where he'd spent most of the day. He put his shoulder to the doors along either side, hoping someone had been lax, but they were locked and barred. He heard the heavy footfalls of the golem coming his way, and Spade kept running, pulling down refuse barrels in his wake in the hopes of buying himself another precious few moments of freedom. Spade turned one corner, then another, hoping that if he was lost to sight, the guards wouldn't be able to find him. They hadn't seen his face, and they'd only heard his voice for a moment, after all. He might live to fight another day, as long as he could get out of town before the others threw him under the wheels in order to try and trim a few years off their own sentences. Spade collapsed against the wall, panting. He took a moment to slip his blade back into its scabbard and to try to catch his breath. There was nothing more suspicious than a man who looked like he was running from something, or so he'd learned over the years. He pulled down his mask, lowered his hood, and stood up straight. When he did, Spade found himself face to face with a gargoyle. He frowned at it. He could swear it was the same gargoyle in whose shadow he'd spent most of the evening, but he was nowhere near the spotter's post he'd squatted in for the past several hours. Before he could even cry out, the stone creature turned its head and looked at him.
"Are you going to come quietly, Spade?"
Lurk asked from where he crouched above the alley.
"Or are we going to do this the hard way?"
Thank you for staying to the end of this story. Night's Watch is the opening piece of fiction from the TTRPG supplement 100 Town Guards, and is available in the link in the video description below. If you'd like to hear more stories just like this one, consider picking up a copy of it, subscribing to the channel, and sharing this with your friends. Until next time.